Hello and welcome to the Warwick Words Digital History Festival. My name's Aaron Manning. I'm a local historian specialising in the history of Warwick Castle and the Earls of Warwick. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about one of my favourite political sagas of the 20th century. I want you to imagine the scene. It's the 27th of October 1923. There's a red carriage pulled by two white ponies coming down the high street. There's crowds everywhere, men waving their scarves high in the air. The carriage pulls up to the courthouse that you see behind me. The door opens and out steps a 61-year-old woman. She's impeccably dressed. A long silk gown, big pearl necklace, diamond earrings, and a big, broad Edwardian hat. It's Daisy, the 5th Countess of Warwick, and she's come back to the town to accept the nomination to be the candidate in the local parliamentary election for the Labour Party. She turns to the crowd, she waits for a big cheer, only to go a big bright red colour herself when she soon realises that all those people in the high street are actually local football fans heading down the park for the afternoon game. This was the beginning of the most dramatic parliamentary election in Warwick and Leamington's modern history. Let's take a seat and find out a bit more. It's really difficult to overstate the importance of this particular moment. Daisy, the 5th Countess of Warwick, was one of the most famous women in the whole of Europe. Born in 1861, she was the daughter of one of the wealthiest landowners in Essex and was herself the wealthiest heiress of her age. In 1881, at the age of 20, she married the future Earl of Warwick at a ceremony at Westminster Abbey and spent a honeymoon at Windsor Castle with Queen Victoria. She went on to become one of the great dames of Victorian high society, a ravishing socialite and a member of the Marlborough house set, and even became the mistress of Edward, Prince of Wales. At the turn of the century, though, she underwent a radical transformation. In 1898, she was heavily criticised by left-wing journalists for her exuberance and her waste of money, and after that she became completely intoxicated by socialism. She was obsessed by the plight of the working classes, slum housing, poor conditions in factories, and the poor education that was given, particularly to poor women. Over the next 20 years, she invested almost all her money in charitable ventures, setting up schools, building poorhouses, and she attended socialist conferences all across Europe. Now, up until 1923, a lot of her charitable ventures, her socialist interests were harmless. She was the champagne socialist. In fact, her family affectionately called her Mushka, the Russian for mother, because although she was spending all of her money on these ventures, they did very little to challenge the established order. So when she arrived in Warwick in October 1923 to become the parliamentary candidate of the left-wing Labour Party in the seat of her husband's ancestral home, well, it caused outrage and sent a shockwave right across the political establishment. Would the hammer and sickle be flying from the top of Warwick Castle? Would the staterooms be converted into slum housing? These are the questions journalists were asking. But I think the reason there was so much outrage and so much shock in the political establishment is because in 1923, for the very first time, the Labour Party had a genuine chance of winning. Since the First World War, the party had completely transformed. Under the leadership of Ramsay MacDonald and Arthur Henderson, the party had completely professionalised. MPs and officials were paid a full-time wage for the first time, plucking them out of the mines and the factories to focus on the political agenda. They moved their headquarters from the north of England down into the heart of Westminster. And Labour MPs began wearing top hats and tails into the House of Commons. Added to that, the benefits of universal suffrage, where the party suddenly had a broad base of support that they could call upon across the country. Add to that the fact that the Conservative Party and the Liberals were fighting in and amongst themselves. There was a genuine chance that the Labour Party could win this election. And if it did, journalists thought, it would spell certain doom for Britain's aristocracy, coming just 6 years after the Russian Revolution. Daisy, then, was a class traitor. But it wasn't going to be easy for her. Daisy was pretty much an unknown in Warwick in 1923. Anyone under the age of 40 would have barely known who she was. You see, for all the good that her charitable ventures had done, they had plunged the family into financial ruin. Put bluntly, the Warwicks were broke. And in fact, Warwick Castle, for the last 10 years, had been rented out to wealthy American millionaires, while the family lived in Essex in exile. Added to this, the local Labour Party was incredibly weak. In fact, it had never put up a candidate in the local election before. Daisy was the first ever Labour Party candidate to stand in the Warwick and Leamington election. In fact, she was one of the first women to stand in an election in the whole of the West Midlands. She also had very stiff opposition. Both parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, put up very strong candidates. The Liberals called on the support of George Nichols, a former MP and agricultural labourer, who they hoped he'd be able to appeal to farmers in a society that was still largely agricultural. The Conservatives, meanwhile, appointed a young and debonair 26-year-old man called Anthony Eden. Now, Eden was the ideal Conservative. He was young, he was handsome, charismatic, aristocratic, and had an impeccable war record. The strength of all of these candidates made Warwick and Leamington a real hotspot of interest for journalists, and they poured in from across the country. But I think the reason this election was so interesting to journalists is also because of the family drama that was just waiting to bubble over. You see, Daisy and Anthony Eden were intimately connected. Daisy's son, Lord Brooke, was married to Marjorie, Eden's sister. Eden was engaged and would marry Beatrice Beckett, whose stepmother was Daisy's daughter. Journalists were just waiting for this family drama to spill out into the public.
Nevertheless, the election began smoothly, and all three candidates took very different approaches to campaigning. Daisy, with her focus on slum housing, preferred much bigger outdoor rallies of hundreds of people, where she can deliver very long orations on the merits of socialism. Eden, for his part, much preferred gatherings of 30 to 40 of the most influential people in local districts, in the hope that maybe those people could influence their tenants and their employers to vote for him. George Nichols, meanwhile, bizarrely, actually went round knocking door to door in the hope that maybe through a word of mouth he'd be able to win enough supporters to take victory in the election. That wasn't until all three candidates on the 9th of November met here at a jammed-packed Leamington Town Hall for a public debate. It was a fiery event. All three candidates came out on the attack. Daisy was insulted for saying that she was a poor woman who had come out the castle to help the poor. George Nichols was attacked for being an agricultural labourer, told that he had no understanding of how to manage a state, let alone a country. But halfway through the debate, Anthony Eden pulled out his ace card, the smoking gun that was going to turn the election on its head. Halfway through the debate, he stood up before the crowd, he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a telegram. Now, the telegram, he said, had been sent to him by the Right Honourable Louis Greville. Now, Louis Greville was Daisy's brother-in-law, and what Eden said he had sent him was a telegram that read that me and my brothers wish you every success in the forthcoming election. Now, of course, what he's implying here is that Daisy's husband, the Earl of Warwick, is backing Eden in the election. Now, if this wasn't clear enough, later that evening, Eden pulled out another letter, this time sent from Daisy's son, Lord Brooke. The letter read that he wished him every success in the election and promised any support in the upcoming campaign. Now, this stunned the crowd into silence. If Lady Warwick cannot win the hearts and minds of her family, how can she win the hearts and minds of the people? Eden told the crowd. While Daisy was raging, she was furious. She attacked Eden for using dirty tactics to undermine her. She then turned her attention to the local press, saying that they were only there for scandal and gossip, not to report on the important political matters of the day. How often do we hear that? Now, as far as Daisy was concerned, this was a turning point. This was the moment that she believed her chances of winning this election were robbed from her by the dirty tactics of her Conservative opponent, in fact, a family member. In reality, though, the election was already slipping away. You see, Daisy was not a great electioneer, and she made a number of extraordinary gaffes on the election trail. At one debate, she was asked by a local resident what her policy would be for the rural community, to which she responded that in line with the socialist agenda, she would outlaw fox hunting and she would call for an end of the Church of England. Now, of course, this might sound good in a London townhouse and spark an interesting debate, but to say this in the heart of Middle England during an election was almost political suicide. At another event, she was asked by a journalist what her policy would be during another world war, To which she responded that had she been a man during the First World War, she would have conscientiously objected. For conscientious objectors are the very best of men. Now later that evening, she also refused to stand and sing the national anthem. Now you've got to bear in mind, she's probably saying these things in front of a packed out hall full of ex-servicemen, many of whom would probably have volunteered. It was not a way to win an election. For me though, I think the moment that Daisy really lost this election was about 2 weeks before polling day, where she was asked by a journalist, would she, as a Labour MP, recognise and work with the Soviet Union? To which Daisy responded with a very long, very gushing speech, praising Vladimir Lenin, the Russian Revolution, the overthrow of the Romanovs, and said that she, as a Labour MP, would welcome communists into Parliament and would work closely with them for what she said would be a stepping stone to the broader communism which is bound to come. Now you've got to imagine she's saying this just a year after the formation of the Soviet Union, the rise of Joseph Stalin, and the annexation of large parts of Eastern Europe into this very powerful, very violent superstate. Now, of course, as you might imagine, she was heckled off the stage, booed by people around her. And I think at that moment, Daisy really knew she had lost the election. And so it's absolutely no surprise that on the 6th of December 1923, election night, Daisy came a disappointing third, scoring just 4,015 votes, mainly from the town of Warwick. Eden, meanwhile, romped to victory, taking almost 16,000 votes in all of the rural districts. It was a small victory for him, though. You see, that evening the Conservatives had a terrible night, losing over 80 seats, while Labour gained more than 50. A month later, Ramsay MacDonald, the Labour leader, arrived at Buckingham Palace and was sworn in as the first ever Labour Party Prime Minister. You see, for me this election is significant for a number of reasons. First of all, it's from 1923 that we can really say that Warwick and Leamington was a Conservative stronghold. Aside from a closely fought election in 1957, the seat remained a Conservative seat until 1997 in the Labour landslide, almost 74 years. It was also the kickstart of Anthony Eden's political career, a career that spanned almost 35 years and saw him become not only the right-hand man to Winston Churchill during the Second World War, but also Prime Minister in the 1950s. But of course, the reason for me I find this election so interesting as a historian of Warwick Castle is that 1923 really is the last time you can see the interest and the influence of the Earls of Warwick and their family being called upon to sway an election. For almost 300 years, the Greville family of Warwick Castle had influenced, bribed, even hustled their way to get their friends and family elected into Parliament. It was clear that the party still hoped that to be the case. The Labour Party only called on Daisy because of her local influence, her name. Eden, meanwhile, had no problem calling on the Earl of Warwick's brother and his son to help discredit Daisy and ruin her reputation. But I think what really showed is that because of universal suffrage and because of the way that elections were now being campaigned, is that the name of the Warwick family could no longer sway an election. In fact, a year later, when Eden was up for election again, he specifically asked the Earl of Warwick not to get involved in an election. Never again were the Warwick family called upon to influence local politics. Now, if you got this far, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say a big thank you, and I really hope you enjoy this talk. And of course, there's so many more talks for you to enjoy. Please enjoy the rest of the Warwick Words Digital History Festival. And if you have enjoyed what you've seen, I would please encourage you, and I'd be very grateful for you to donate anything you can to ensure that local stories like this can continue to be told for many years to come. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the festival.